This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 40 of season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, October 1st, 1910, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Mr. and Mrs. Walter Wright and Mrs. Elizabeth Whitney are enjoying an autumn sojourn to the White Mountains. Mrs. Alvin Fisher has recently returned from a visit with the Jack Fishers at their home in Hartford, Connecticut. Jack was her son. This opportunity of getting better acquainted with the 3 grandchildren in this pleasant home was especially enjoyed. At the close of the visit, Miss Ruth Fisher and Miss Eva Fisher, 2 of her daughters, went down to Hartford for the weekend and escorted Mrs. Fisher home. Mrs. Helen Layton and daughter Frances were over Sunday guests at Mrs. Mary E. Fletcher's. Our popular motorman, John Sherlock, and Mrs. Sherlock moved the first of the month from Mr. Spaulding's house into the house near the Common, recently vacated by the B.F. Days. The motorman was the guy that ran the trolleys through towns. Dr. and Mrs. Atwood, who have been spending the warm season north and part of the time with their Westford relatives, returned this week to their home in Dayton, Florida. The Westford relatives were 3 unmarried sisters who lived at 4 Graniteville Road. Westford friends of Miss Mary Olivia Patton were saddened this week to hear of her death at the home of her sister, Mrs. A.F. Conant. Her single name was Sarah Jane Patton in Littleton. Mrs. Patton's early home was in Westford, and she always retained a warm love and interest in the place and for former contemporaries. A cellar hole is all that remains to show what was once the pleasant farm building of the Rufus Patton homestead, just off the Forge Village Road on the westerly side of Westford Hill. Unfortunately, the old building was destroyed by fire several years previously. Mrs. Gertrude Hamlin left this week to resume her studies at Miss Kimball's home school for girls at Worcester. Mr. and Mrs. Calvin Howard have recently returned from a pleasant vacation at Salisbury Beach, where they rented a cottage with mutual friends from Tingsboro. Frank C. Wright is detained at his home with malaria, and Warren Carkin is driving the RFD Route number 1 for him. The Edward M. Abbott Hose Company was well represented at the Firemen's Convention in Lowell last week, Friday afternoon. After the big banquet, a picture of the assembly was taken. This was remarkably clear, and it is interesting to pick out our local members from the hundreds of faces. J. Herbert Fletcher has presented the company with one of the pictures nicely framed to hang on the walls of the room at the firehouse. A real estate transfer of much interest is the sale of the Austin H. Foss place to William L. Woods, who has been superintendent of the Brigham Farm for a number of years and will bring to the management of his new property the energy and practical experience necessary to make it succeed. Mr. and Mrs. Woods, many friends, are glad to have them remain in town. Mr. and Mrs. Foss, F-O-S-S, left Tuesday for South Lake Weir, Florida, where they have large orange groves and other fruit. The grapefruits are now demanding their owner's attention. Mr. and Mrs. Foss have many friends in this village and wish them much success in the change they have made, which is on account of Mr. Foss's health. Members of the Tadmont Club will bear in mind the first meeting of the season next Tuesday afternoon in Library Hall at 2:30. Someone has asked what kind of souvenirs should be used in answer to the roll call. The chairman of that meeting would suggest the usual broad interpretation of the word souvenir, something in remembrance. It may be a keepsake, a relic relic of antiquity, a reminder of personal experience, a treasure obtained on some excursion, a bit of jewelry or historic ornament. Each member should add a few words of explanation. The next section is called Party. Mrs. J. Willard Fletcher, at her pleasant home in the Westford Depot district, entertained a group of friends Wednesday afternoon, the memory of which will linger long with those who were so delightfully entertained. Mrs. Fletcher understands well the happy art of combining the genial hostess and capable housewife, which so ensures the enjoyment of guests. Whist, music, and merry sociability engrossed the first part of the afternoon, after which the company was bidden to supper, served on the spacious screened-in porch. A delicious menu of clam chowder, steamed clams with regular accompaniments, salads, lima beans, rolls, coffee, melons, sherbet, cakes, and bonbons was fully discussed. After lingering to enjoy the beautiful autumn sunset over the Stony Brook Valley, the guests took their departure. The annual agricultural fair, held under the auspices of the Congregational Church, was a fair in all the various phases that go to make up a successful result in an effort of this kind. It took place last week, Friday afternoon and evening at the town hall, and the beautiful fall day and moonlit evening was fully appreciated by the committee in charge, as was also the generous patron and hearty spirit of cooperation among the workers. The hall presented a most attractive appearance with its prettily decorated tables for candy, aprons, fancy articles, food, samples, and children's post office. The stage setting of autumn foliage and flowers was particularly well done. There were excellent specimens of fruit and vegetables from the Cold Spring Farm. Houghton G. Osgood had a fine exhibit of 11 varieties of apples. Among novelties noticed were some handsome red currants, also some skillful flowers carved from vegetables by a man employed at the Osgood farm. Among other exhibitors were noted the names of Boynton, Pine, Jenkins, Sweetser, Decatur, Wheeler, Wallace, Hildreth, Taylor, Atwood, and J.W. Fletcher. From 6 to 8, an appetizing supper was served to a large number of people. The entertainment in the evening consisted of readings by Mrs. Belle Harrington Hall of Lowell, who has previously made such a good impression with Westford audiences. Through a misunderstanding, the singer who had been engaged failed to appear, but Mrs. Hall supplied the deficiency to the satisfaction of all. About $150 was realized from the enterprise. The next section is called Death. Henry J. Benoit died at his home in this village Friday night, September 23rd, after a 3-week struggle with typhoid pneumonia. Skilled help and the vigor of young manhood seemed powerless to control the ravages of the disease. This is the single case of typhoid in the village in this autumn, and it is not known how the disease was contracted. Mr. Benoit is survived by a widow, Ruth Miller Benoit, and an infant son, Everett Miller Benoit, and to this stricken young woman, hardly past girlhood, the sincere sympathy of the community goes out. The dead man also leaves a father living in Lowell and brothers and sisters. Mr. Benoit had recently entered the employment of Oscar R. Spaulding and started to establish a home for his family in the Timothy Fletcher House, owned by Mr. Spaulding. The deceased received the last rites of the Catholic faith previous to his death, and the funeral was held from the Catholic Church in Graniteville and was largely attended by relatives and friends. The floral tributes were numerous and beautiful. The next section is the About Town section. The second child of August Nelson, a boy of 18 years old, is still critically ill with typhoid fever at his home at Mills Corner, 1½ miles below Brookside Corner. The Sunday School of the Old First Parish Church will organize for Love and Labor Sunday, October 2nd, directly after the morning service. The choir of the church was favored again last Sunday, with the deep and melodious Albert E. Prescott at bass. The regular meeting of Westford Grange will be held on Thursday evening, October 6th, and the next meeting of the Middlesex North Pomona, Friday, October 7th at Oddfellows Hall, Lowell. The next section is called Political. At the Democratic Caucus on Tuesday evening, Edward Fisher, chairman of the town committee, read the call. John M. Fletcher was chosen chairman of the meeting, and William Henry Harrison Burbeck, secretary. Delegates to the several conventions were elected as follows: State, Edward Fisher; Congressional, John M. Fletcher; Senatorial, Albert R. Wall; County, Michael McGlinchey; District Attorney, John L. Flynn; Councilor, George H. Burke; Representative, Angus MacDonald and Robert J. McCarthy. The Republican Representative Convention for the 11th Middlesex District, including the towns of Ayer, Acton, Chelmsford, Charleston, Littleton, and Westford, will be held at the Town Hall, Ayer, Saturday, October 8th at 2 p.m. At the Republican caucus held on Wednesday evening, the Honorable Herbert E. Fletcher, chairman of the town committee, read the call as a member of the Governor's Council and candidate for re-election. He was legally disqualified from presiding, and George H. Hartford was elected secretary, and the following delegates were elected without opposition to the several conventions. State, the Honorable Herbert E. Fletcher and William R. Taylor. Congressional, George T. Day and George H. Hartford. Senatorial, Alfred W. Hartford and Wesley O. Hawks. Councilor, Sherman H. Fletcher and Fred A. Sweat. County, J. Arthur E. Wilson and Edward Hanley. Representative, Harry L. Nesmith, Alvin Nelson, Thomas Danio, Samuel L. Taylor. Town Committee, Honorable Herbert E. Fletcher, Alfred W. Hartford, Julian A. Cameron, Charles M. Troll, Walter A. Wooden, J. Arthur E. Wilson, Harry L. Nesmith, Andrew Johnson, Alvin Nelson, Edwin Hanley, Fred A. Sweat, Thomas Danio, Wesley O. Hawks, Edward M. Albert, and Samuel L. Taylor. Seems like there were more Republicans in town than Democrats in 1910. The next paragraph is about the Westford Grange. Westford Grange bunched into barges, double teams, single teams, electric cars, and steam cars, and bounced to Chelmsford last week Thursday evening to their neighbor's night invitation from Chelmsford Grange. 65 went this way, and so far as heard from, no one went any other way. It was a jolly good time party, all the way there and return from there. The stay there was a long feast of laughter, while 16 gentlemen of Westford Grange impersonated the ladies' degree team in the farce The Third Degree, with masks, skirts, flounces, shirtwaists, and ribbons. They marched and countermarched. If it was not up to real prize-winning military style, it was up to a continuous roaring of laughter. The Grange Orchestra added to the elasticity of the swing of affairs by their timely chiming music under the direction of Arthur J. Blodgett. Joseph Wall was Grand Bandstand Director and Military Order General and led the first platoon. The second platoon was manned by the tall, graceful, nimble Andrew Johnson. In the ranks as overseer was J. Willard Fletcher, chaplain Horace E. Gould, treasurer J. Everett Woods, lecturer Alonzo H. Sutherland, steward William R. Taylor, gatekeeper Fred Clement, Flora Fred Blodgett, Ceres Charles Blodgett, Pomona David L. Grieg. Those officer titles are all officers of the Grange. As candidates for the progressive marching orders, Louis Jenkins and John Feeney Jr. kept up with the turnabout march and the humorous, unprogressive, and contradictory advice. The grand final laughing spat was the capers of the Oliphant, Andrew Johnson, with two candidates astride, and Joel Wall with the big stick as elephant tamer. The next section is the Ford's Village section. The infant daughter of Mr. and Mrs. John McNiff was christened Hannah Hannah Sunday morning at St. Catherine's Church, Graniteville, by Reverend Father Doherty. Mr. and Mrs. McNiff, who came from Keighley, England, followed the custom of the land of their birth by entertaining a number of their friends at tea Sunday evening in honor of the event. Among those from out of town were Mr. and Mrs. T. Corcoran, John J. Lynch, Thomas Lynch, Miss Sadie Lynch, Miss Teresa Ferguson, Mr. and Mrs. Anthony Mullen, Mr. and Mrs. Manis, and Michael Welsh, all of Lowell, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Binns of South Barry, Miss A. Emmett and Miss R. Emmett of Lawrence, and many of their neighbors who enjoyed a delicious and dainty tea. Alvin S. Bennett has returned from Worcester, where he went last week to take up the affairs of the Bay State Stamping Company during the absence of his brother, John Bennett, manager of the concern. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett attended the reunion of the GAR at Atlantic City. Miss Grace Lawrence and Miss Elizabeth Plummer are enjoying the beautiful days of early autumn at the White Mountains, where the scenery now is at its best. Miss Priscilla Bennett returned with her sister, Mrs. August Meyer, to Boston Sunday, where she will spend several weeks. A son, not given in the paper, but it was Francis Joseph Hosmer, weighing 9 pounds, was born to Mr. and Mrs. William Hosmer, Friday, September 23rd, at their home on Pleasant Street. Mrs. George L. Sanborn and Miss Eva May Lord have returned from a very enjoyable visit to Boston. Alvin S. Bennett spent Tuesday visiting with Mr. and Mrs. George Smith at their home in Tingsboro. Mr. and Mrs. William Burnett were guests on Sunday of Reverend and Mrs. Thomas L. Fisher, their former pastor, at his summer home at Leggett Hill, Pratt's Junction. Mr. Fisher left for Sioux Falls, North Dakota, where he will take up missionary work on October 1st. Wilbur E. Parsons left for Vancouver, Washington last Thursday after disposing of his real and personal estate. Mr. and Mrs. Parsons will reside for the future in the West. Mrs. Parsons, who was a local correspondent for the Westford Wardsman, is now correspondent for the Vancouver Columbian, a newspaper printed in Vancouver, Clark County, Washington. Services were conducted last Sunday afternoon at St. Andrew's Mission by E. H. Hilliard of Groton School, who opened the Sunday school for the fall term. Next is the Graniteville section. Mrs. Walter C. Wright has returned from an enjoyable vacation spent in Provincetown. Mrs. John A. Healy and Miss Fanny McCarty were guests at the Firemen's Convention held in Lowell last week. They were entertained by the firemen's wives and daughters of Lowell and report an enjoyable time. Mr. and Mrs. Provost also attended. J.J. Downing has returned to Albany, New York, after a few days spent with his wife and daughters at the home of Mr. and Mrs. David Moran, and Miss Lily Moran has returned after an extended visit with friends at Beachmont. The Graniteville Athletic Club has certainly got busy, and their football club is sure to be a success. The boys have already got in some good practice work and will be in fine trim for their game with Forge Village, which will be played on the home grounds here on Saturday, October 1st. A return game will be played in Forge Village 1 week later. Great interest is being taken in the coming games, and the loyal rooters from both clubs will be found on the sideline. The next section, the last one, is entitled Accident. Thomas Rafferty, the well-known stone contractor, met with a serious accident while at work on his quarry in West Graniteville last Saturday morning. In blasting out a piece of stone while working with his son Michael, quite a quantity of dynamite was used, and both men got away what was considered a safe distance before the explosion. Although Thomas Rafferty was the farthest from the blast, a small-sized, jagged piece of rock hit him in its descent back to the earth, ripping an ugly hole in his left side and splintering the hip bone. He was brought to his home in the village, and Dr. Warren H. Sherman summoned, and later Dr. Orion V. Wells of Westford was called. It was found necessary to take 18 stitches to close the wound, and the patient is now resting as well as can be expected. That's the news in Westford for the week ending October 1st, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Westford Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.